After the release of Metroid Prime in 2002, Retro Studios was in something of an anomalous position for a subsidiary of Nintendo. They had taken a 2D franchise that was never a heavy hitter in terms of sales, and translated it into a 3D experience praised by almost everyone. You have to go all the way back to Super Mario 64 for another example of a series making the leap from 2D to 3D this smoothly. Even then, you have to consider that Mario 64 sold fewer copies than both of its console predecessors. Prime, on the other hand, was and is the best-selling and best-reviewed Metroid game of all time. Not only that, but with Prime we have the rare opportunity to compare it with another game in the same series, which was released on practically the same day, Metroid Fusion. And despite the fact that Fusion was cheaper, released on a platform with a much larger install base, and was made by one of Nintendo's best internal design teams, Prime still kicked Fusion's ass from here to Hong Kong, completely changing people's expectations of what Metroid is and should be in the process. Retro's success left an impression on Nintendo that I think they're still struggling to fully appreciate 2 decades later, but it also left Retro itself with a tall order to fill. Make another Prime game that would keep things fresh and interesting, while also not losing that unique spark that made the original Prime so compellingly different from other first-person shooters, as well as, when you get right down to it, most Nintendo games. They didn't have an eternity to make this new game either. The second Prime game would end up taking a little less than 2 years to complete, which admittedly is about how long the original Prime was in development, but compared to other Nintendo games, this is a very tight window. Wind Waker was made in a similar amount of time, and even though it's a fantastic game, it's also notorious among fans for a rushed development that led to some pretty obvious cut content. Nintendo fans are no strangers to long waits between releases, especially for Metroid games, but after the release of Prime, Nintendo clearly wanted to strike while the iron was hot. But did they strike gold? Well, yes and no. Echoes got good reviews, and was no slouch in terms of sales, but it didn't sell as well as the original Prime. In fact, and this is kind of embarrassing, even though Corruption is the poorest reviewed and most criticized of the Prime games, it still ultimately sold more copies, putting Echoes in 3rd place. Why did Echoes underperform in this way? It probably has something to do with the advancement of the first-person shooter genre as a whole. When Prime originally came out, consoles were not a good place to go to for shooters, so Prime stood out as a contender even though, as I said in the last video, the combat isn't that great. By the time Echoes released, there were a lot more options, and I think many fans simply fell away from Prime as more visceral and intense console shooters captured their attention. Another problem is that Echoes' story, while interesting, does almost nothing to advance the themes of its predecessor. It tells a mostly self-contained story with very little connective tissue to Prime. The only major development that's trilogy-related at all is the introduction of Dark Samus, a character who doesn't actually start driving the overall plot until the beginning of Corruption. Both the good guys and the bad guys are totally different, and the only thing connecting them to previous guys in any way is that in a single lore entry the Luminoth mention meeting and learning from the Chozo at some point. That's pretty weak. Compare this to, say, the Halo series, in which the second installment directly follows on from the first and involves many of the same major characters. The Covenant, the Flood, the Halos, Evil Cirque, it's all in there. Halo 2 is clearly part of a larger story that was set up by the original Halo. Echoes mostly isn't. It spends the vast majority of its time in a little corner of the Metroid universe doing its own thing. And is that really a good use of an entire game, especially when you have only 3 total to tell your whole story? Actually, yes, it is. At least as far as I'm concerned. If everything I've said so far has made you think I dislike Echoes, then that was my mistake, because I love this game. Echoes is actually my favorite of the 3 Prime games, and the only one I routinely go back to for another run. If you're able to look at the Prime series as just 3 games in a row, and not a coherent trilogy, in some ways the story of Echoes is actually better than the story of the trilogy overall. If I had to pick one element of Echo's design that makes it stand out from the rest of the series, it would be its flair for the dramatic. The original Prime had fairly realistic-looking environments and encouraged a detached, analytical attitude in the player, reinforced by the solitude of Talon 4. Echoes, by contrast, is hyper-stylized and focused around big dramatic moments, boss fights, encounters with the Ing and Dark Samus, trips to Dark Ether, and so on. In Metroid Prime, Samus was exploring a wild, deserted planet looking for clues to the mystery of Phazon. In Echoes, she's invading the lairs of dark, creepy aliens to take back her stolen powers and restore planetary energy to the light world. If the original Prime is a BBC nature documentary, Echoes is an episode of Captain Planet. Not only is there a living, friendly NPC in Echoes, but there's also an entire civilization which, though just barely hanging on, isn't dead and buried like the Chozo were in previous Metroid outings. It's hard to overstate how much of a departure this is from the rest of the series. Samus has always been a lone wolf, whose primary goals during her missions have been reconnaissance and sabotage. It was never about protecting anyone or anything, but in Echoes, protecting an alien race from destruction is Samus's primary goal. The scene at the end, where Samus receives a hero's welcome from a crowd of applauding admirers, is totally unprecedented in the series, and probably felt kind of weird to many Metroid purists. Despite all these differences, what's really interesting about Echoes is that it manages to include, or at least refer to, a lot of traditional Metroid-y ideas in its mostly separate story. Or maybe I should say stories. Because the truth is that there are really 3 stories, involving 3 totally separate groups of characters, going on in the background of Echoes' campaign. These stories don't follow the same pace as the game overall. In fact, 2 of them are already finished before you even make it to the end of the Agon Wastes. But they connect to each other, and other entries in the Metroid saga, in some unexpected and intriguing ways. So what we're looking at here is one big story with 3 parts, except what should have been the middle part is instead 3 side stories, of which the smallest and least interesting is the one that's most closely tied into the other 2 parts of the main story. This is one heck of a trilogy, isn't it? The story that serves as an introduction to the world of Echoes concerns a crew of Galactic Federation troopers who followed a space pirate ship to Ether and ended up stranded on the planet's surface after an electrical storm destroyed their ship. A series of trooper logs describes the troopers' attempts to repair the ship and call for help, while simultaneously fending off attacks from an aggressive species of insect which they call splinters. Despite their best efforts, they were ultimately overwhelmed by sheer numbers and wiped out, leaving behind only an improvised underground base which forms the setting for Echoes' tutorial. Even more than the rest of the Metroid franchise, this story is similar to and probably inspired by the 1986 film Aliens. Like the classic sci-fi action movie, it revolves around a group of human soldiers trying to survive underground while being attacked by alien bugs. It even has a feisty female marine with a chip on her shoulder. And, like Aliens, the story of the GF troopers is dark and tragic, more of a horror story with some science fiction overtones than a typical science fiction story. But this is nothing new for the Metroid series. Super Metroid, for instance, has no shortage of gruesome imagery or implied violence. What is new here is an emphasis on individual characters. Every soldier in Echoes has a different story to tell and a different attitude about their situation. Some are cautiously optimistic, others pragmatic and precise, while still others have clearly lost all hope and become despondent. These aren't generic archetypes like the space pirates and Chozo from Prime. While the lore entries are too short to really flesh them out, they are actual characters with personalities that are at least hinted at. And Echoes isn't just the first game in the series to have lore entries with individual characters attached to them. It's actually the only one. Even Corruption, whose plot involves nearly half a dozen major characters, has its lore associated with broad groups rather than individuals. The GF, the Brionians, the robots on Elysia, and so on. This character focus is a unique hook that makes the opening of Echoes memorable, but unfortunately there wasn't much that the writers could do to expand on it after the first hour. The story of the GF troopers is essentially double landlocked within the context of the overall plot of the trilogy. Not only is it set in a game that does its own thing plot-wise, but the troopers themselves don't really interact with either the Luminoth or the Ing, whose conflict forms the basis of Echoes' main plot. This dark story, interesting as it is, doesn't constitute anything bigger than a footnote in the context of the Prime trilogy. However, there are 2 important developments that take place after it, while Samus is exploring the ruined command center. The first is the appearance of Darklings, reanimated corpses which are later explained by the Ing's powers of possession. On a first playthrough, the Dark Troopers and Dark Splinters aren't explained by anything in the trooper logs, so they come across as mysterious and disturbing. There's also something quite sad about the troopers being taken to pieces by Ing-possessed insects, and then being possessed themselves to attack Samus. The other important development is Samus's first, and unintentional, trip to Dark Ether through a portal created by Dark Samus, during which she's attacked by a mob of Ing and has most of her gear stolen. This is a retread of a plot point from the original Prime, but I think it's done much better here. Instead of the loss of power being due to a random explosion, in Echoes it's taken away by evil creatures, who are later established as power-hungry thieves. In dramatic terms, this is possibly the strongest introduction that any Metroid game has ever had. It's also something that the game designers are able to do a lot more interesting things with. In Prime, Samus happens to lose her upgrades, and there just happen to be identical ones scattered around Talon 4. In Echoes, Samus is actually tracking down and reclaiming the same upgrades that were stolen from her, which makes each battle against the Ing feel like a victory over adversity. And in order to win, she has to survive her powers being used against her, which does a lot to keep the boss fights interesting. Echoes has a lot more boss fights than Prime, but despite that, I feel like the fights are also generally better. What was an occasional imposition in Prime is one of Echoes' strongest attractions, and in that sense, Echoes really did manage to do Prime bigger and better. Of course, there are other things that Echoes ended up doing smaller and worse. Notably, you may be wondering at this point what happened to those space pirates that the GF troopers were chasing, which is what started this whole mess in the first place. I mean, they are only the main antagonist of the entire Metroid franchise, after all. Well, it turns out that after the debacle on Talon 4, a few pirates managed to escape with some equipment and a handful of Metroids. One thing they were pretty low on, though, was Phazon. Luckily for them, the meteor impact which split Ether in two left the Dark Half absolutely stuffed with Phazon, so the pirates started leading raids into Dark Ether to replenish their supplies. As they built up a supply of Phazon, however, they noticed that a familiar figure was popping up near their camps. Familiar, but certainly not welcome. Samus. At least, they originally thought it was Samus. They later discover, however, that this Dark Hunter had no intention of destroying their facilities, and was really only interested in one thing: acquiring energy from Phazon deposits. This was, of course, Dark Samus, and one of the last bits of pirate lore suggests that they were thinking of forming an alliance with her to take out Samus. That doesn't seem to have worked out, however, as Dark Samus is later seen just stealing their Phazon, and most of the pirates later end up either dead or possessed by the Ing. So I know what you're thinking. Hold on a second. Phazon, Space Pirates, Dark Samus? I thought you said that Echoes doesn't really tie in with the rest of the trilogy. How does all this not count as a connection? Here's the thing. At first glance, the Space Pirate section of the game, which takes place about midway through the Agon Wastes, certainly seems like it's maintaining the Samus versus Pirates dynamic that the rest of the Prime trilogy is built on. But it doesn't really work. First of all, just like the trooper logs from earlier, the pirate lore in this game is seriously scaled back from what it was in Prime. We're talking about 2-sentence blurbs where there used to be entire paragraphs of text explaining the pirates' goals and motivations. And I'm not surprised that the pirates don't say much in Echoes, because the fact is that they don't do much in this game either, especially plot-advancing stuff. Just like the Federation troops, they spend their entire storyline under siege in their own lab as the Ing and Dark Samus attack them. They basically come up with one idea the entire time, the whole team-up with Dark Samus plan, which subsequent events seem to suggest didn't end up working anyway. The pirates in this game are a token inclusion, a sop to the idea that you have to have space pirates in a Metroid game. The writers do almost nothing with them after you blow through their lab, less than halfway through the game. Now, I admit that the writers of Corruption ended up going in an interesting direction with the whole Space Pirates and Dark Samus angle, and Echoes did help to set that up, but setup is all Echoes has in this department. There's also the encounters with Dark Pirates and Dark Pirate Commandos, but these are really basic, and also, especially in the case of the Commandos, really overused. There is no polite way to put this. Dark Pirate Commando encounters in Echoes are a pain in the ass. The first few times you fight them, they are moderately interesting. The 20th time, I was biting my controller in half. The problem is that there's no really creative or efficient way to deal with them, so they feel like a waste of time whenever they show up, which is constantly. The Commandos basically occupy the same niche in Echoes that the Chozo Ghosts did in Prime, but unlike the Chozo Ghosts, they usually lock the exit door, so you have to either fight them or wait around for them to get bored and leave. It almost feels like Retro is making you fight the same pirate enemies over and over again to distract you from the fact that the pirates aren't actually important to Echoes' plot. So then, what about Dark Samus? A shadowy figure with mysterious origins, hunting Samus down relentlessly to wreak revenge. And in Corruption, Dark Samus is basically the main antagonist of the game. Surely she has to be one of the most important factors in Echoes' plot, right? No, wrong. Dark Samus just doesn't work as an antagonist. Not in Echoes, at least. The problem is that Dark Samus' motivations aren't just unclear, they're practically non-existent. She could work with the space pirates to trap Samus in some kind of sting operation, but she doesn't. She could manipulate the Ing in order to overwhelm Samus with sheer firepower, but she doesn't. Instead, she just keeps showing up for target practice level duels with Samus, and every now and then does something that mildly inconveniences the player. If Dark Samus is supposed to feel intimidating, then there was a serious failure of execution somewhere. None of the 3 boss encounters with her throughout Echoes are more than mildly challenging, and what's more, she doesn't attack in a way that suggests raw aggression or an uncontainable desire for revenge. Her moves are actually quite slow and predictable, and on normal mode they don't do much damage either. My biggest fear during these fights was that I would get a repetitive stress injury from jabbing the A button with my thumb. The boss itself just isn't scary or menacing in the least. The idea that Dark Samus is looking for revenge at any cost also doesn't fit in with the way she acts in cutscenes. Dark Samus had a golden opportunity to kill Samus right at the beginning of the game, when Samus first traveled to Dark Aether, but she held back and let the Ing attack Samus instead. If she's supposed to be relentlessly chasing Samus down, why do you only see her about half a dozen times over the course of the game? The SAX from Fusion does a much better job of selling the idea of mindless aggression, and as a result, encounters with it feel tense. Dark Samus just comes across like she's playing with you. Eventually, Dark Samus does grow into a prominent antagonist, but it takes a long time. More than one game, in fact. In Echoes, she's there for flavor, not substance. The meat of Echoes' story is elsewhere. So far, Echoes has given us one story that's really interesting and unique in the Metroid series, but also really short and disconnected from everything else, and another story that takes a stab at moving the trilogy's overall plot forward, but which is kind of boring and aimless, all set up and no payoff. However, both of these stories together make up hardly 10% of the game. Echoes' real story, which has already started to unfold before you get to Agon Wastes, is about the war between the Luminoth and the Ing for control of Aether and its planetary energy. A lot of people on YouTube have discussed Echoes' exploration of the concept of duality, and how this harkens back to earlier Nintendo games with similar themes, most notably A Link to the Past on the SNES. What I haven't heard people talk about, and what is far more unique to Echoes, is its exploration of the concept of war. Previous Metroid games were set in a natural world, where the primary conflict was Samus versus the environment. But in Echoes, it's one race of aliens versus another, and Samus caught in the middle. I wouldn't describe the opposing forces in Prime as being particularly warlike. The Chozo were peaceful philosophers, and even the pirates come across as more brainy than brawny. Ridley accepted, of course. But both the Luminoth and the Ing are fighters, and it's interesting how Echoes explores both the positive and negative aspects of this. The Luminoth lore speaks of heroic acts of defense, and the bravery and esprit de corps they showed even in the face of complete disaster. Meanwhile, the Ing are portrayed as kind of Klingon-y, obsessed with brute strength and constantly engaging in physical combat, even with each other, to prove their superiority. Another design element that reminds you you're fighting in a war is the sheer amount of bodies strewn about Aether. Prime had a bit of this in the pirate frigate, but in Echoes they're everywhere, space pirates as well as Luminoth. It's one of the reasons Echoes feels more like a horror game than Prime did. You're constantly being reminded not only of how many lives the Ing and the atmosphere of Dark Aether have taken, but also the sheer number of different ways that they're capable of killing you. You'll find Luminoth who died from blunt force trauma, stab wounds, poisoning, immolation, starvation, heart attacks, even suicide. Echoes isn't a gory game, but it doesn't pull any punches when it comes to showing the brutality of war. Yet at the same time, the sacrifices of the Luminoth aren't all in vain. Without their raids into Dark Aether, and the crystals and beacons they left behind, Samus would be helpless to fight back against the Ing. One of the strongest oppositions that Echoes draws is the one between tension and relief, and Dark Aether does this brilliantly, especially early on. Dark Aether is so intimidating that even crossing a room sometimes feels like a battle. This is actually something the game loses once you get the Dark Suit, and it's a real double-edged sword. See, when you first explore Dark Aether, you lose health so quickly outside of the crystals that the game can't throw very complicated obstacles at you, because you would die trying to get through them. A lot of people say they hate this part of the game, because you have to worry about your health so much. But I find that somewhat confusing, because this is the actual hook of Dark Aether in the first place. The danger is what makes it interesting, and honestly, the Dark Suit tips the balance too far in the other direction. Playing through the game again recently, I never came close to running out of health after the Agon Wastes, except for one particular moment. You probably know what I'm talking about here. It's one of the most infamous moments in Echoes, the Boost Guardian fight. Practically everyone who's played Echoes has their own horror story about this encounter, and I remember dying easily half a dozen times to it the first time I played. On my most recent playthrough, though, even though I got low on health at one point, I still beat it on the first try. The truth about the Boost Guardian is that it's kind of like quicksand. The real danger from it is not that it kills you outright, but that it makes you panic and flail around, which is what really costs you. There's a huge difference between the low amount of damage it inflicts through simple contact and the battering you can get while it's boosting around. If you can get into a good rhythm, jumping at the right time while it's boosting, knowing when to go into morph ball mode and bomb it, and so on, it's actually not that hard to avoid it. But if you're running away from its attacks, you'll end up bumping into it all the time. It's kind of like a Dark Souls boss. Relatively easy if you know what you're doing, but brutally difficult if you don't. I think the Boost Guardian fight is a great metaphor for the whole concept of Dark Aether in general. The more you play Echoes, the more comfortable you get with the handicap that it puts on you, which also means that the Dark Agon Wastes becomes more fun, and the other regions of Dark Aether become less fun because they're not dangerous enough. In fact, the more I play Echoes, the more I feel that, in a strange way, Dark Aether actually gets more and more poorly designed the farther you get into the game. There's no question that the light world of Aether improves as you go along. Agon Wastes is honestly a pretty boring area apart from the Pirate Lab, with Torvus Bog being slightly more diverse and interesting, and Sanctuary Fortress being a total blast, and in my opinion the single most memorable part of the game. The Ing Hive, on the other hand, I honestly find pretty boring. One of its biggest problems is how disconnected it is, which makes it feel oddly cramped despite being a mirror version of the largest and most interconnected map in the game. Dark Agon Wastes, by contrast, has you traveling around two fairly large portions of the map, which later turn out to be connected. You can go from one corner to the other without ever traveling back to the light world. What ends up happening is that the trips to the Dark Agon Wastes at the beginning of the game feel like unique adventures, while the trips to the Ing Hive at the end of the game feel more like temporary distractions. Dark Torvus Bog, just like its light counterpart, is right in the middle of the extremes. There are some really exciting moments, especially in the underground part, but overall its disconnectedness makes it feel less like a real place. It's hard to get immersed in an environment where the shifts to the Dark World come at such predictable and contrived moments. The Crypt, in particular, is a serious low point. Speaking of which, one thing I agree on with Mark Brown is that the interdimensional puzzles are pretty lackluster. They simply don't tax your brain enough to be interesting, while also taking up a lot of time. This makes them feel more like chores than puzzles. This is taken to an absurd extreme with the transit station in Sanctuary Fortress, which has you go through 4 different portals just to snag a power-up located on a spider ball track. By the way, this is also a room with no connections to any other in the Ing Hive, which seems like a real missed opportunity. Echoes has a lot of fun puzzles, but none of them are these. So if I agree with his point on the interdimensional puzzles, does that mean I also go along with him on the tediousness of the key hunt at the end of Echoes? Well, yes and no. I was actually quite surprised on my recent playthrough by how little I enjoyed going through the Dark Temple grounds, which, just like the Ing Hive, is extremely disconnected and ends up feeling contrived and a little dull. This part is something I remember enjoying more on earlier playthroughs, but I will say that it suffers a great deal from having no unique enemies or puzzles, which makes the exploration feel more like just wandering around until you find the one thing you're looking for. On the other hand, I enjoyed revisiting the 3 main regions a lot more than I expected to, especially with the inter-region elevators making travel between them a lot more convenient, something Mark seemed to suddenly forget about in the middle of his section about backtracking. Another thing Mark ignores about both the key hunt at the end of Echoes and the artifact hunt at the end of Prime is the fun you can get out of revisiting old areas with a fully equipped character. I mentioned in the last video how great it feels to torch previously frustrating enemies with the plasma beam in Prime, but there's also something to be said for simply moving through rooms in a different way from how you did it the first time. Echoes does this even better than Prime, actually. Not only are its rooms generally more open and easy to pass through, but Echoes also has the screw attack, which has got to be one of the greatest implementations of a classic 2D power-up in 3D Metroid. It makes movement through wide-open spaces feel so effortless and graceful, at least when you don't mess it up. Because of things like this, Echoes manages to make backtracking more fun, while also forcing you to do a lot less of it than Prime did. Finally, one last thing to point out. I think Mark's laser focus on structure causes him to miss part of the appeal of an endgame collectathon, and that's the sense of dramatic and atmospheric pacing. Echoes alternates between stretches of tense challenge and periods of relaxation, just like Prime does, and the revisiting of old areas is one last time to relax, albeit a little more than you actually need, before the extreme tension and challenge of the endgame. And if you're wondering why anyone likes this part of Prime or Echoes, let me try to illuminate that with another question. Why does anyone like Shadow of the Colossus? For more than half of that game, there's no obvious goal and no real challenge. You just wander around the Forbidden Lands trying to find the next battle. On many occasions, you're not even traveling through a new area for most of the journey. Why would the game waste your time like this? The reason is that it's not really wasted time. It's pacing. The game is letting you anticipate the challenges to come. By boring you a little bit, it's striking an effective contrast that makes you notice things about the world and the boss fights that you probably wouldn't otherwise. After all, you can't see the light if there's no darkness to make it stand out. Now at this point you might be thinking that if the key hunt is supposed to make you appreciate the final boss fight by contrast, that means I must really appreciate that fight, shouldn't it? Actually, I'm not a big fan of the Emperor Ing encounter. It's not a bad fight per se, but compared with the impression made by Metroid Prime at the end of the last game, it comes across as dramatically unsatisfying. While you were fighting Metroid Prime, Samus looked and acted like a hunter, chasing it through multiple rooms as it tried to burrow to safety, and finally slaying it with the very same Phazon that made it so powerful in the first place. Ironically, the fight itself isn't a huge challenge. Personally, I think Meta Ridley is a lot harder, but it feels really satisfying to win it. Meanwhile, the fight with the Emperor Ing is much slower paced and more difficult, which you'd think would add tension, but in my experience it just makes it feel tedious to replay. Not a good thing when the player is going to die several times before succeeding. It also suffers from not actually being the final encounter of the game. Dark Samus is, and while I can see what they were going for here, I would argue that lumping these two fights together at the end detracts from both of them. You can't relax after finishing off the Emperor Ing, meaning you don't get the full sense of catharsis from it, and at the same time you have a really generic final encounter with Dark Samus, in which you beat her with that old Zelda trick of absorbing her shots and then firing them back at her. This is the worst of both worlds. It's easy to figure out how to do this, meaning it doesn't feel all that special, but also difficult to execute properly, which makes it perversely easy to mess up and lose the fight. Trust me, dying to Dark Samus after spending 15 minutes chewing your way through the Emperor Ing makes you feel really stupid, and it's hard not to resent a game for making you feel that way. However, lackluster final boss notwithstanding, I love Echoes, and I don't wish that it was different. I wouldn't necessarily say I think it has the best story of the trilogy. Corruption gets a lot of brownie points with me for what it tried to do. But it certainly has the best style and sense of aesthetics, and I have more fun replaying it than I do either of the other two. It may not have much to do with Phazon, but the story is gripping and dramatic in a way that Metroid rarely is, and Aether is a fascinating setting that rewards close inspection. In some ways, Echoes compromises on the things that made the original Prime so unique and refreshing. The lore is a little more simplistic, the theme's a little more generic, and the bad guys are so outlandish they nearly cross over from science fiction into the realm of pure fantasy. But in other ways, Echoes is a classic example of a good sequel. With Prime having set up a strong mechanical basis to work from, Echoes focused on an abundance of new design ideas, the vast majority of which are good. Not all of them, though. It may be a tad less believable than Prime. Talon 4 almost felt like a real place at times, and by contrast it's hard to forget how much Aether is a product of someone's imagination. But both games are immersive in their own way, Prime through realism, and Echoes through drama and action. Fundamentally, though, the freewheeling fun of Echoes' design is also what keeps it from effectively advancing the trilogy's story. It keeps things interesting by distracting you from Phazon, not by developing it as a theme. And this major failing, from a structural standpoint at least, is precisely what forced the last game of the trilogy, Corruption, into an overcorrection that led to its own major failing, at least as far as Metroid purists are concerned. Prime walked so that Echoes could run, but Echoes didn't do the same for Corruption. Instead, it tried to fly away, and kind of succeeded, but by the time it was over, the overall plot had screeched to a halt. If Retro had just forgotten about the whole idea of a trilogy, which actually is what Nintendo seems about to do with Prime 4, this wouldn't have been a big deal. Metroid games had never had one continuous story over multiple games before. Why should they now? There was only one real reason, because Retro wanted to see if they could make it work. Did they succeed? Well, that's a story for another day. But the short answer is yes, mostly.